What if I told you that not all religions are rooted in deception, but the most powerful ones are? That the stories we've been taught to call sacred are built not just on myths, but on manufactured truths, strategically designed to control minds, shape empires, and erase alternatives. See, it's easy to look at religion and call it false, but the real question isn't if it's false. It's when it became false, because not every sacred story started as a lie. Some were born out of wonder, some were born out of trauma, and some were born out of ambition disguised as revelation. So today, I want to trace the shift from the stories around the fires to doctrines enforced with fire, from myths that helped us make meaning to systems that rewrote history and demanded obedience. Because if we don't understand the difference between honest speculation and known falsehoods, we'll keep giving sacred trust to systems that were never honest to begin with. Most religions were born out of honest speculation, a raw human attempt to make sense of the unknown. Death, thunder, the stars, the seasons, the ache for justice. These early stories weren't lies, they were metaphors. They were how our ancestors turned mystery into meaning. You look up at a sky you don't understand and you say, maybe someone made that. That's not necessarily deception. That's curiosity wrapped in imagination. But then there's something else. Some religions weren't just metaphorical, they were manufactured, built on known falsehoods, not speculation, not sincere attempts to understand, but strategic fabrications and attempts to deceive. Stories pushed as literal truth even when the people spreading them knew they weren't true. They knew the documents were forged. They knew the authors weren't real. They knew the contradictions were impossible to reconcile, but they preached them anyway because it wasn't about truth anymore. It was about control. So let's define it clearly. Honest speculation is the myth-making of a curious people trying to understand life, death, and meaning using the best stories they had at the time. Known falsehoods are the myth management tools of powerful people designed to enforce obedience, shape empires, and crush dissent. And if we don't understand the difference between the two, we'll keep giving sacred trust to systems that were never honest to begin with. Let's begin with ancient religions. Let's go back, way back, before popes, caliphs, and councils, before books were canonized and heretics were burned. There was something far more primal happening. Early religion wasn't about dogma. It wasn't about controlling what people thought. It was about trying to understand what the hell was going on. We're talking about honest speculation, the kind you find in ancient animism, in early Egyptian spirituality, in Mesopotamian myths, or in the Vedic hymns of early India. Nobody was faking it. Nobody was trying to pull a fast one. These weren't theologies. These were stories, cosmic poetry, attempts to wrap language around the chaos of existence. Cosmic awe. When they saw lightning rip across the sky, they imagined a god behind it, and natural fear. When floods came and they begged the river to spare them, and even communal bonding, when they told stories around firelight to teach values, pass on wisdom, and make sense of suffering. These stories evolved slowly across generations. They weren't handed down by divine decree, they emerged. And most importantly, they didn't come from one central authority with the power to punish dissent. Even when myths became part of royal ideology, like Egyptian pharaohs claiming divine status, there wasn't this hard line between fact and fiction. People didn't ask, is this historically true? They asked, what truth does this story carry? The line between myth and meaning, ritual and reality was soft and porous. These weren't lies, they were cultural mirrors, not manipulations, but metaphors, not revelations, but reflections. So when we talk about ancient religion, we're often not talking about deception. We're talking about imagination in motion, people reaching, stumbling, wondering, and that's what made it honest. Now let's talk about Judaism, which I want to highlight as sort of a transition point. This is where the story starts to bend, where religion shifts from honest speculation into something more strategic. Not quite lies yet, but no longer just myth either. See, Judaism, especially after the Babylonian exile, became something different. It wasn't just about understanding the gods anymore. It was about preserving a people. After Jerusalem was destroyed and the Israelites were scattered and humiliated, they did what traumatized communities often do. They rewrote their story. But not to deceive, to survive. They took fragments of tribal memories, oral traditions, ancient myths, political folklore, and wove them into a narrative of chosenness, covenant, and divine destiny. Books like Genesis and Exodus became more than stories. They became national therapy, a way to process defeat, reclaim identity, and declare we are still here and our God is still with us. Were these authors trying to lie? Not exactly. They were doing what humans do in crisis: meaning making. They mythologized history not because they were frauds, but because they were desperate to find order in the chaos. It's not accurate to call these texts known falsehoods, but they also weren't pure myth anymore. This was myth with an agenda, still speculative, but now selective, still sacred, but now strategic. The writers likely believed or needed to believe what they wrote, because belief wasn't just about theology, it was about survival. So Judaism marks a turning point. It's where religion in the Abrahamic faiths begins to take on political memory, ethnic identity, and moral authority, not just spiritual curiosity. And that shift would lay the foundation for something far more dangerous later on. Religions that don't just reflect power, but manufacture it. Christianity, the shift to known falsehoods. Here's where everything changes. Because while early religions were built on wonder, and religions like Judaism evolved into myth with meaning, Christianity took it a step further and made a deal with deception. This wasn't just honest speculation. This wasn't just identity storytelling. This was strategic fabrication. Let's start with the Gospels. They weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were written decades after the events they claim by anonymous authors and then falsely attributed to disciples to give them legitimacy. They tell conflicting stories, borrowed plots, and embellished miracles, and yet they were passed off as direct history. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a marketing campaign. And then you've got Paul. The man never met Jesus, but somehow he becomes the chief architect of Christian doctrine. In his letters, they don't just interpret Jesus, they override him. In many cases, Paul contradicts the teachings of the man he claims to follow. It's not Jesus' religion anymore, it's Paul's theology. And it gets worse. Forgery in the New Testament was rampant. Scholars across the board acknowledge that books like 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and 2nd Peter were not written by who they claim. These weren't innocent errors, my friends. These were intentional deceptions forged in someone else's name to push a specific agenda. And then there's events like the Comma Johannium, a forged line about the Trinity added centuries later into 1 John to settle a doctrinal debate by pretending that God said it. That's not divine revelation, that's theological fraud. And church fathers, they weren't just passing these lies along, they were editing, suppressing, and silencing any text that didn't serve the empire's version of the truth. Gospels were burned, alternative Christianities were crushed. Truth wasn't discovered, it was declared. And what began as a radical Jewish sect was transformed into an imperial religion that demanded obedience, loyalty, and belief at the barrel of a sword, not a question. This isn't myth, this isn't metaphor, this is manufactured belief enforced by manipulation. Christianity didn't just preserve stories, it produced propaganda. It built its foundation not just on speculation, but on absolutely known falsehoods, and used those falsehoods to shape empires, crown kings, and control the conscience of the world for centuries. And then Islam. New revelation or the next replication? Now let's talk about Islam. Because if Christianity was the prototype for religious propaganda, Islam was the sequel. But here's the thing, Islam didn't just borrow from Christianity, it absorbed it, repackaged it, and weaponized it with even more precision. Like Christianity, Islam claims a divine origin story. But unlike Christianity, Islam centers its authority in a single man, a single book, and a single empire from the very beginning. And that gives it an advantage and a danger. See, when we look at Muhammad's early movement, it's easy to paint it as revolutionary, a push for tribal unity, social reform, and even spiritual awakening. And maybe, in part, it was. But it didn't take long before that revolution turned into regulation. The Quran was compiled decades after Muhammad's death under Caliph Uthman, who burned all the other versions to preserve just one. That's not divine preservation, that's narrative control. And the Hadith, thousands of sayings, most of them forged, created to justify legal, political, or theological agendas. Entire schools of thought were built on fabrications and yet passed off as sacred truth. Let's be clear. Many of these hadith were invented after the prophet's death to settle disputes, expand power, or silence dissent. In other words, Islam became a closed system. One man, one book, one path. Question it, and you weren't just wrong, you were a heretic, a traitor, and a target marked for execution. And like Christianity, Islam plagiarized and repurposed older myths from Adam and Eve to Abraham and Moses, claiming to correct them, while actually co-opting them for its own imperial identity. It wasn't about truth, it was about inheritance. The Quran became the final word by declaring itself the final word, not by proving it. And just like Christianity before it, Islam used those claims to build caliphates, laws, wars, and empires, all in the name of a truth that could not be questioned, let alone proven. This wasn't mythology anymore. This was doctrinal absolutism, a system that didn't just tell stories, it erased alternatives. So while Islam may have started with some type of spiritual energy, it quickly followed the same pattern. Centralize power, control the narrative, destroy the competition, call it divine. And just like Christianity, Islam didn't just survive history, it scripted it. So here's the million-dollar question. Were Christianity and Islam the first religions purposefully built on lies, known falsehoods? Probably not. But they may have been the first to scale the lie. Earlier traditions, they told stories, passed down myths, made meaning in the dark. But Christianity and Islam, they weaponized those stories on a level the ancient world has never seen. These were the first mass-scale text-based religions to deliberately falsify key text and claims, use state powers, armies, emperors, and legal codes to enforce belief and demand exclusive truth based on those fabrications. This wasn't folklore anymore. This was imperial dogma. The Roman Empire made Christianity mandatory by law. The Islamic caliphates institutionalized belief with military expansion and legal theology. And the result? Religions that didn't just spread by persuasion, they spread by policy, by conquest, by censorship, and by fear. Earlier traditions evolved over time, but Christianity and Islam were frozen in text, canonized, weaponized, and enforced as if every word had come directly from the mouth of some god. And once a story becomes law, once belief becomes mandatory, once doubt becomes punishable, you're no longer dealing with faith. You're dealing with control disguised as devotion. That's what makes Christianity and Islam different. Not just what they believed, but how they used belief. Not just what they said, but what they silenced in order to be able to say it seriously. So let's zoom out, because if we're going to talk about religion honestly, we've got to recognize the evolution of belief systems, from story to strategy, from mystery to machinery. It starts with early speculation, not lies, not dogma, just human beings trying to wrap language around life. Their stories were evolving, symbolic, and metaphorical. Religion as reflection, not yet control. Then came mythic meaning-making, a wounded people rebuilding an identity. Their myths served survival, not deception. It was national memory written as divine covenant, not entirely fabricated, but definitely focused. And then religions like Christianity arrives. And that's where myth becomes mechanism. Strategic forgery, false authorship, suppressed alternatives. It wasn't just belief anymore. It was a system engineered for obedience, designed for dominance. For the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity is a clear shift from speculation to known falsehoods. And Islam, it took that same formula and refined it. From one book, one prophet, one empire. It mixed politics with theology and enforced both with narrative control. There may have been sincerity at the start, but power rewrote the script. So what does that leave us with? A timeline of belief that starts in curiosity and ends in conquest. What began as honest questions about the stars became declarations from the throne. What began as myth became mandate. And if we're ever going to reclaim our humanity from systems built on half-truths and holy frauds, we've got to know where the story shifted and why it still shapes the world we live in. Because not all religions evolve from asking honest questions, and the ones that have done the most harm to our humanity are demonstrable fabrications. If truth is the goal, then the truth should be told. If this conversation stirred something in you, if you've ever felt the tension between what you were told to believe and what you now know to be true, you're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. That's why we created Bridge City 101, How We Change the World, a free self-paced course that introduces you to the mission, mindset, and methodology of what we're building together as Bridge City Global. It's not a lecture, it's a conversation. A light forum-based space where you can reflect, respond, and engage with other community members on this same journey. There's no pressure to finish unless you're feeling compelled to get more involved in an official way. But for those who do complete it, we've opened up something special, an alumni study hall, a space where graduates can dream together, build together, and even launch projects and events that reach their local communities. Because this isn't just about deconstruction, it's about reconstruction. It's about reimagining what's possible when people come together, not around superstition, but around shared purpose. So if you're ready to go deeper, not into dogma, but into community, clarity, and real world change, click the link, join the course, and let's build something that actually deserves your trust. Bridge City Global. We're not here to keep the faith. We're here to keep evolving together. So with that being said, check out the other videos on the screen. And until next time, keep rising.